Tariffs, the destruction of our economy, and the danger to our national security. Those are the topics for today. Hi, I'm David Dubato, and this is the No Delusion Zone. I can't think of two better individuals to discuss those topics than my guest today, Jonathan Sweet. He's retired from the U.S. Army after a 30-plus year career in the military intelligence branch, and Mark Toth, who was a successful business entrepreneur and is now a journalist who specializes in national security and international relations issues. Together, they are two of the most sought after geopolitical analysts anywhere, and I am very happy to have them back with me again. So, gentlemen, welcome back to the No Delusion Zone, John and Mark.
Hey David, thanks for having us back in the zone. Appreciate it.
David, great to be back. Thank you.
You bet. You bet. Well, as I said off air, and it's impossible to escape it. And I said it, of course, in the brief intro. We're going to start with tariffs and how they do relate to obviously our economy, but also to our national security and the security of our allies as well. So I'm going to throw it out to both of you. Today, actually, 9 April is I don't know what it's called. I don't know if it's Liberation Day 2 or whatever after last week, but today a new heavier round of tariffs were put into place by the Trump administration, which, at least in China's case, brings the total tariffs to 104%. And as everyone knows, most of our imports come from China. So this is unprecedented and potentially very, very dangerous. So I'm just going to ask either one of you, what do you for number one, is this a calculated move? Is this just insane? What do you think is going to happen first with our economy? We're talking the United States, and then we'll go from there. Either one of you, what is this new round going to do to our economy, at least in the short term?
Yeah, David,
I'll,
I'll go first here, and then let John get to the military side of it. I think first and foremost, it's important for viewers to understand. And again, this is an apolitical assessment. I'm going back decades ago to when I was a practicing economist. This formula that Trump has come up with is nonsensical. When you look at it, it's simply taking any given country's trade deficit with the U.S. and then dividing it by the amount of trade exports that they do to the U.S. to come up with this fake percentage. There's no reciprocity here. It has nothing to do with pre-existing tariffs that those countries have imposed to come up with that percentage. It's just this bizarre non-supported formula that he's come up with. And then to further compound that nonsensical approach, he divided it by two, calling it the 50% Trump discount. So I think it's important to understand that as the markets try to grapple with this, as our allies and foes try to grapple with this, it just doesn't bear any connection to reality of what tariffs countries may or may not be imposing upon us. So from that standpoint, to me, just if I'm going to look at it purely from an economic standpoint, it looks like a bad opening bluff in a poker game. So if initially he called it liberation today, I'd argue we've gone straight to Valley Forge. We're in the days that try men's souls because people are trying to figure this out. Now, it may work. There may be method to his madness, but there's not genius behind his approach. And so from that standpoint, I think it can be very damaging because in my opinion, there doesn't only not seem to be able to seem to be a economic plan to protect American small businesses, et cetera, that are going to bear the brunt of this immediately. I mean, some of these people have shipments on the way that once they hit ports, they're committed to paying for. Now they've got to pay these tariffs. They're the ones doing that. How do they pay for that? Many little small businesses are going to go broke.
Well,
And then
before we even
see,
get to
yeah,
Jonathan,
yeah,
I'm sorry.
okay.
No, go ahead. I'm sorry. No, no,
Yeah.
no.
Let me finish the second point
Yeah,
here.
yeah.
And then what you also have is that you don't have a military or a foreign policy plan behind it because this approach is just hitting friend and foe alike. And I think from John's perspective as a military guy, that's problematic because it's going to weaken our coalition. But go ahead there.
No, I just wanted to ask for those of my viewers, which is most of them that are not economists, could you just very briefly explain, because this is the core, I believe, of Trump's theory. What is it, a trade deficit? What is it, and why is that not always the problem here? If we have a trade deficit with a country, why is it not always wise to slap them with a punitive tariff?
Right. Okay, let's use an example. We'll create a fictitious state since it's gotten a lot of memes, and we'll call it, Penguinistan, the little penguins. Say those little penguins sit on a bunch of key rare earth minerals. They don't have a lot of industry. They don't have a lot of population. They don't have a lot of need for imports. Okay. But they have something that the US badly wants. These rare earth minerals sitting under them. So our economy, it being a growth mode economy, is going to want to take and extract as many of those rare earth minerals to produce cell phones, to produce military technologies, et cetera, from that country. So you might have a trade imbalance, a deficit with that country, where they're getting a lot of US dollars, but we're getting something of value in return. And we're taking what we're getting in return and we're turning that into even more money. So it's really overly simplistic to take a look at it purely from a trade deficit. Now, there are some cases, in the case of China, where there are pre-existing tariffs or barriers to enter into certain sectors of the economy that are valid. And those are things that should be negotiated and discussed at, a multilateral and a bilateral basis. But to go about it the way that Trump has done, this blanket approach, doesn't take into account the realities of how we trade with different countries, what compels us to trade with some of these different countries, because not all of it is just trading for economic purposes. Some of it's for defense purposes, some of it's to achieve, force projection bases for the US military and the like. There's a lot that goes behind it. And so this idea that, Trump, the businessman, can reduce all of geopolitics into an economic equation, a nonsensical one at that, is just ill-conceived.
John, you want to add to that, or you want to wait for the military end of it? No, I mean, you don't have to. The
No,
first
that's
part of the
fine.
opening round, they did want to just try to stay purely economically because, as everyone knows that reads anything today, our economy is in rough shape. I mean, Wall Street's going bananas. And I don't know where this is. And he doesn't seem to be backing down. I think that's what's mystifying the so-called experts, especially Wall Street. And either one of you can disagree with me here. Nobody really thought he was going to go this far and that he was going to double down as he did this week. But he did. And I don't see any indication he's going to back down. Do either of you?
I don't, not at the current pace. And like you said, it really is a self-inflicted wound. And from a national security perspective, my thought would be this: the timing's bad. I mean, the timing's probably never good, but the timing's bad. You have a European continent in contact. Okay, you have European partners, NATO partners, concerned about the outcome of an event that's going on in Ukraine and how it may or may not affect them 1 to 3 years down the road. What they need is an ally they can count on. And what they're getting right now is an ally that seems to be throwing up roadblocks, picking at scabs, okay, and not providing the assurance that they're going to be there. Look, just yesterday, there were reports that the United States is going to withdraw from some forward logistical bases in Poland where materials are going into Ukraine. And again, a second report came out, and we've heard this before, that the United States was considering withdrawing 10,000 soldiers from East Europe. Okay, so you get these activities and these actions, you combine it with a terrible timing as far as wanting to impose tariffs on the EU as the EU is trying to raise funds to support activities in Ukraine, and it just has all the ingredients of bad timing. And wouldn't it be nice if he would just explain to the American people what his end state is going? The news at night, as former presidents have, used that Oval Office and present to America. What are you doing? Because right now, the vacuum is being filled by all sorts of folks trying to interpret what's going on. So,
John, what do you think about that? I want to follow up on what you're talking about from a national security standpoint. What do
sure.
you think the danger is in the short to medium term of our closest allies? We're talking England, of course, and Europe, pulling back, retreating from being our closest allies. First and foremost, of course, would be in intelligence sharing because of the
Yeah.
huge debacles that are going on now. But if they're squeezed past a certain point economically, it's not in their best interest to continue to treat us as a valued partner. How do you see that playing into our loss or problems with our national security?
I mean, eventually it comes to a head. And Mark has said this before, and we've written about it on multiple occasions. if we, withdraw from Europe, or we reduce our footprint in Europe, and we continue to do this to our European allies, we lose the projection to project. We lose the capability, that is, to project force throughout the world. Okay, Ramstein is a key hub in Germany from which we project force. Okay, we have training facilities in Constanța, Romania, where we project force. And at the same time, we're doing this to our European allies. Yesterday, you hear Pete Hegseth say that he's relying upon allies to help them with what they want to do in Panama by preventing China to gain greater influence. He's saying we have to turn to our allies for support. Hey, eventually the allies aren't going to come for support because they're not getting anything in return. Okay, and what they want in return is assurances. They're not sending us bills. Okay, they're not demanding, contracts. They just want assurances that when the flag goes up, we're going to be there to support them. And right now, it just seems from a transactional perspective, that may or may not happen, depending upon what they're available to give. So,
Well, Pete Hegseth also said, in terms of cost cutting, he's seriously contemplating cutting 90,000 active duty troops, soldiers from the U.S. Army. What are your thoughts on that?
yeah, how does that align with the administration's focus right now, which is on China in the Pacific? How are you going to take on China with 90,000 less soldiers? Okay, how are you going to take on China with allies who may or may not step up to the plate with you? Maybe Japan or South Korea decides in some cases it may be better to just work with the Chinese. Yeah, it's just I don't understand it. But at the same time, if I'm not mistaken, didn't they just announce that they want an additional $1 trillion within the Department of Defense's budget? And
Where's that going to go? I mean, good question. Mark
maybe
or John, where's that going to go? It's not going to go to those soldiers' salaries.
Weapons. Yeah, maybe weapons, maybe ships,
Yes.
maybe additional munitions, but someone's got to operate that. And by cutting, I don't know where the 90,000 cut comes from. So maybe there's an explanation that there's dead weight out there they can cut. I don't know. Is it 90,000 troops? Is it 90,000 people within the defense industry? I don't know, but it's.
I think a lot of it's going to come from all of our cyber defense forces. As you know, they are cutting those to the bone. I think, and correct me if I'm wrong, didn't Trump eliminate the office, the division that targets Russian cyber against the United States? That's gone.
He certainly handcuffed them. I think they turned off offensive cyber against
offensive cyber is gone, and 90,000 soldiers. Maybe a lot of them were cyber soldiers, or I don't know, but I don't see where cutting our active duty forces, or reserve for that matter, is going to be a very wise cost cutting measure to go along with the tariffs, which are pissing off all of our allies. But again, I may be missing something. I obviously am, because I think this is insane, and we are more vulnerable now in terms of our national security than we have at any time in my lifetime.
Yeah, and certainly Russia and China have invested heavily in the cyber domain. So it does create vulnerabilities, additional vulnerabilities. We're already overwhelmed, but now when you take away certain capabilities, you're right. It doesn't make sense. It'd be nice if someone would explain to the American public what the plan is. Maybe the plan's classified. I don't know. Maybe there's more to it than on the surface, because there seems to be a number of fairly smart people that have signed up, to join the president. We just don't know what what is it? So,
well, explain this to me, Mark. You probably could. If anybody can, you can. Why, with all of these tariffs, these cuts, and this just lunacy, why haven't any additional tariffs or any economic sanctions been put on Russia in the last 2 weeks, especially?
Yeah, David, partly because, there's the argument. I'll give you the administration argument, is that, look, it would be negligible to begin with because there's just essentially no trade happening between the U.S. and Russia and North Korea and some of these other foes. And so that it would somehow be counterproductive to try and negotiate a ceasefire. And I use try lightly. Putin's not interested in a ceasefire. This is just gamesmanship. John and I wrote about it a week or so ago in the Hill, basically saying Putin's just trying to buy time here for an offensive that's likely coming in the summer or spring in Ukraine. And so there are two rationales for it. I would kind of flip this conversation back, though, in the immediate term. 2 points I'd like to make from what you guys were discussing just now is that you've got to look at this from the damage the damage of the messaging itself. You've just had the first month or so of this administration basically telegraphing to NATO member states, you've got to up your defense spending. You've got to get to 5%, that you're not doing enough. And now you're imposing these tariffs that are going to hit some of these countries, including Germany, for instance, in its car industry, in the worst of ways. And so, in an immediate real effect, how are we asking these countries to invest more in defense when we're destroying the very economy that has to fund that added defense expenditures? It makes no sense. So, I mean, if you're someone sitting there in the EU, you're like, wait, what's the game plan here? Is this about trade, or is this about defending against Europe, defending itself against Russia in the future? What is it that you want out of us? Because those are seemingly contradictory messages that are happening. And let me give John some credit here, because I think sometimes in the scheme of things, I kind of get pegged as the economist kind of guy in our discussions, and John, the military type. A huge part of John's job, as I've come to know it and understand it, over the past 30 years, has been understanding the economic implications of what we're seeing. For instance, early on in the discussions, it wasn't me in some of our early articles that was arguing, let's look at China's Belt and Road Initiative. Let's look at what that means, that economic expansion, what that might mean in terms of military expansion. It was actually John, not me, the economist, that was picking up on that. And I think that's what's important, that as we look at these economic issues, it's really important that we circle back and understand how they implicate future national security decisions by ourselves and by China. Because one thing, and I just mentioned this on Cairo TV on Sunday, I was on a panel discussion, and it was interesting because I was up against a Chinese official who was giving the party line. And they have come to play. They're not going to back down easily. And they've done a lot of preparation for this. The Chinese think longer term than we do. You get to do that in a totalitarian state. They've already had outreach programs to the EU saying, look, let's combat these Trump tariffs together, which is something that was effectively negated in a EU connection after the Ukraine war started. They've been doing the same thing with South Korea and Japan, US allies in the Indo-Pacific. And so if we're wanting to pivot there from a military standpoint, from that pacing military threat, we're driving some of our Asian partners, our key economic Asian partners, into it. Into the hands of China. And then you have someone like Vietnam, which makes no sense. Their tariff rates are not indicative whatsoever of the tariffs that they've charged. Vietnam is almost an innocent party in all of this. Let's use them as a real quick case example. When the first Trump administration said, hey, you've got to start diversifying, you've got to get production out of China, get it into more areas, a lot of multinational companies said, fine, we'll buy into that. And they moved it into Vietnam, a lot of production manufacturing facilities there. And so, but those profits don't stay in Vietnam. A portion of them does. So Vietnam's getting hit with these tariffs that are going to affect their economy, even though they've not received the full benefit as an economy of those businesses because they're not Vietnamese owned. So it's like, from a geopolitical standpoint, it's ridiculous what he's doing, because a one size fits all is not fitting every size. And it's these future military implications that are going to be very negative. If you want to pivot to the Indo-Pacific, and I noticed that Elbridge Colby just got approved, the Undersecretary of State, who is naive, in my opinion, thinking that Ukraine is not that important. He'd even argue Iran, in some instances, is not that important. He's now an undersecretary. He just got approved by the Senate and confirmed. And he's the guy that's arguing that China should be, first and foremost amongst the threats we're facing. None of this adds up. There just seems to be no master plan that's discernible, and it's frustrating.
Well, what you're giving John credit for, and rightfully so, I think, is he was discussing China's soft power initiatives in the past and for the last how many decades. I may be wrong here, but Trump specifically doesn't understand soft power. He just doesn't get it. If he did get it, he wouldn't be driving our allies into China's arms like this. There was just an article today about how the Philippines, who we did start to become our closer allies again. They were allowing us back into the Subic Bay area and Clark Air Force Base and some other things. Now they are considering getting closer to China, and they're just one of many, many. You just discussed that, Mark. Soft power. Mark, what is soft power? Again, for my viewers who don't know anything about this, or John, why is that so important, and why, or what we're doing, the antithesis of that, the opposite?
Yeah, let me start and John give you the military side of it. Soft power is key. Is someone who grew up abroad. I have kind of a unique experience here. You cannot underestimate the value. I spent nearly all of my childhood, as did John in many instances abroad. You cannot underestimate the value of soft power. That is U.S. aid programs. That's showing up when there are national emergencies. I mean, just as one example, we have the embarrassing situation in Myanmar that just had this horrific earthquake that killed thousands, as I understand it. The scenes from there are devastating. And we had three people on the ground that were part of the rescue effort that received termination notices from the Trump administration on the ground. They're living in tents, they're trying to save people, and they're obviously having to leave the country. China's there, Russia's there, certain of our allies are there, and yet we're pulling out. That has, the optics to that are bad. People see that. And you get to this reliability. And, even if, at an economic level, if you look at someone like Bill Ackman, he's been a supporter, he's a hedge fund guy. He's been a supporter of Trump. Even he's saying, look, you've got to be careful here about confidence in the economy. People have to trust the U.S. word. You have to trust the U.S. markets. And you're destroying that trust. And it's not easily rebuilt. Well, that's what we're doing in terms of soft power, this aid that we get. For instance, people may argue, hey, what business do we have of protecting people in Africa against AIDS? I'd say a lot, because look, that's not only a key market for rare earth minerals and where you want to be growing and establishing stronger relationship with these governments. Is John and I've written, again, I'm going to give John credit here because he was the one early on suggesting this. China has gone after massively the rare earth minerals and sub-Saharan Africa. They've been doing these outreach programs through soft power, AIDS, economic development, et cetera. And we're pulling back from all of that. And it just doesn't make sense. It's just a bad approach to be taking. John?
Yeah, look, I witnessed the China firsthand when I was in Djibouti as the J2 for CJTF Horn of Africa. And I observed China come in with their Belt and Roads Initiative. And what they did was that they would build road networks, they would build rail networks, they would build harbor facilities, they would build the mines, then they would extract the material, utilizing their networks to get that material all the way back to China to turn into green energy type of products to sell to who? To sell to the West. But the point is soft power is a tool. Okay, it is something that has a return on investment, but it has a long-term return on investment. And the Trump administration seemingly doesn't want to wait for the long-term return. They want that transactional business deal. I give you something now, you give me something back now. And here's one thing that Mark and I wrote about also. That influence, that money pouring into East Africa, all the things that they were investing in, that caused East African countries or resulted in East African countries voting in the UN on proposals that were favorable to China and to Russia. It changes the outcomes of votes. It leverages countries to continue to support, the country that's supporting them financially. And again, I saw it firsthand. From a macro perspective, it's soft power is a good thing. Now, from a Trump perspective, he sees soft power, I think, in some cases, as in a safety net to help people that has turned into a lifestyle of sustainment. And there may be some truth to that too, but there's got to be a balance. There has to be a balance in order for us to maintain influence in a region, in order to maintain positive, outlooks towards the United States. Otherwise, we're going to isolate ourselves unintentionally or intentionally. And it's just going to make things that much more difficult. Again, when we talk about force projection and getting out to do certain things, countries aren't going to want to play with us anymore.
Yeah, let me quickly add to that. One of the key components of soft power is one of the things that allows you to avoid having to use military power. It's another tool in the asset. As John likes to write about DIME, the different instruments of national power. It's a key part of that. You need all of it on the table. You can't start taking things off. And John and I last week, while John was in Germany working on an assignment, we wrote a piece that, Trump is losing World War III. And we argued that he's doing that on several levels. He's losing the World War III ideologically that Putin is waging against the West. I'd argue China is as well. And then metaphorically, he's losing this economic war through tariffs and through the diminution of soft power and the like as well. And it's like, what's his end game here? Because I don't see where we come out a winner in any of this. I was asked this on Cairo TV, and it was hard. All right, I'm sitting there across, or not sitting literally, but I'm on screen across from a Chinese official, and I, my answer was, look, China does unless the U.S. gets back into this game. You can't play this game with throwing your cards on the floor. You need all of them to hold your hand. Now, being the good American, of course, I argued, look, China's overplaying their hand as well. They're bluffing. They obviously can't force project at this point in terms of the military, but we need to get back into this. And I don't think the Trump administration fully understands just how much their actions in Ukraine, through the tariffs elsewhere around the world, is basically giving this huge green light to China long term. And then China in the short term is using the vacuum to start doing things like we saw harassing in Indonesia, invading their economic zone, the encirclement of Taiwan recently and new military exercises. They were doing live fire exercises off of Australia. And then in the Tasman Sea, that body of water that separates Australia from New Zealand, they were showing force with their Navy flowing through that. So, I mean, you add all of those things up together. China clearly thinks they're in a strong position. They're not about to cave in. And Trump at this point seems to think he has a winning hand, but not the way he's playing it, not if you throw these cards on the floor, including soft power.
Well, one of the many galling things about this is that all of the military and intelligence and diplomatic folks around Trump do know the value of soft power. They do. They speak about it even now, some of them. So they know that. But the Peter Navarros and some of the other people that are around him, no, they don't. In fact, what was that piece just recently where Peter, it's not recent, but it's come up again, where Navarro had invented this economic expert years ago who was in favor of tariffs. And apparently Trump bought that, and he's basing these insane tariffs, the theories he has on tariffs based on a fictitious character. It doesn't exist, that Peter Navarro suggested to him several years ago, and it stuck in his brain until his second administration. And now he is implementing the economic policies of a fictitious person. This doesn't surprise me. I wish that Trump was a fictitious person, but I can't. That's just not reality. No, they don't. He doesn't get soft power, but all the people do. The elected GOP officials do. Our senior military officials do. Our intelligence folks do. Department of State people do, including Marco Rubio. And I am disgusted that they aren't standing up to him. I know you have to follow the boss. I get it. But you don't have to go down with a sinking ship. It's a matter of national security. And I've said this to you guys before. Falling on your sword, ever hear of that? Not you guys, but integrity, standing up for what's right, even when you have to confront the boss. None of them will do that. It's a cult. And it's very, very exasperating, because what you said is true about the closest wing nuts around him. But all of the other senior officials, military, diplomatic, and intelligence, do know the value of soft power, and they're not doing a damn thing about it.
Well, what we don't know is what's said behind closed doors.
Oh,
And I
sure.
like to think, and
Yeah.
I think behind closed doors, I would like to believe, particularly on the military side, that you're getting frank advice from your military leaders that saying, "Sir, you need to consider this, or have you considered this?" So you're right.
Hey,
Behind closed
John,
doors,
let me interject and then let you run with this a bit. There is some overt advice coming. The outgoing theater commander in Europe, right, do I have that position right? Cavioli did come up and say and has pushed back publicly about withdrawing U.S. forces from NATO. So go
Yes.
ahead, John.
Yes.
no, and you're right. He did. And I think from a perspective of being as senior as he is, and maybe at the tail end of his assignment, you get a lot of people after they retire to come out and say X, Y, and Z. But for job security, and I'm not saying he's protecting his job. He said the right thing that needed to be said. I'm saying generally for job security, most people aren't going to speak out loud outside the office because, yeah, and you support you support the administration, but behind closed doors, you got to be that voice, and you can't be worried about losing your job when you know in your heart that what may or may not be going on is either good or bad for the country. And that's frustrating, particularly from a military perspective. You're taught, from day one as a cadet, you have a voice and you air that voice. Now, you're also taught you get one rebuttal and then you salute the flagpole and you move out. And if you don't like it, you either resign, right? Quit or whatever, but you do get a rebuttal. And we're taught that, but I'm just not seeing that. And that's what's frustrating. And we didn't see it with the Biden administration either. There were plenty of times in which officials should have pushed back on the Biden administration on what they were doing, and they simply didn't. And Mark and I were very frustrated about that too. So it's not just a D or an R thing. Right now, it is a thing.
Well, I think that the real test is going to come, and I pray we don't actually see this. But the way things are going, I'm not so sure. What am I talking about? That if and when national, federal law, or martial law is declared through the Insurrection Act, the Alien Sedition Act, whatever, that President Trump orders federal troops out on the streets into major cities, not just for immigration purposes, but to round up criminals, his enemies list. And don't say it can't happen. I hope it doesn't either. But my point is, and I guess my question is, if and when that happens, we've got the active duty military, American military, on the streets, rounding up criminals, alleged criminals, without due process. I wonder what military leaders, the leaders we're talking about, Jonathan, you had mentioned this right now, how many, even if it's only 10, that don't live up to their oaths, that don't have the integrity, that feel that they need to listen to the commander in chief, or maybe they actually agree with him. When that, if that happens, then we are in a shooting civil war. And I'll be very frank with you guys, I don't think we're that far away from that.
Yeah, I think that's a big if. Okay, and I think
Oh, I agree.
the probability of that right now, I think is low. It's never unlikely. Okay, there is a probability, I guess, but it is extremely low. I don't see that. I see the commanders out there. I see the soldiers out there to understand what a lawful order is, and we have lawyers within the ranks that reinforce it. Even though, rightfully so, there's been discussions about lawyers being pulled out of the Pentagon to get other lawyers in there with more favorable recommendations. But we understand what a lawful order is. I hope it doesn't come to that. I don't think it will come to that.
But don't you think that the firing of all the heads of JAG, the IGs, all of the rest of this, and there's much more that I'm not getting into. Don't you think that's all part of this build up to the possibility of what I'm talking about? And let's be honest, gentlemen, many of the things we're seeing today were thought of to be absolutely impossible. That's far fetched. It'll never happen. Like voting with Russia in the UN, for example, against Ukraine, one of many. So, no, I don't know. I think that the plan is there and that it's not as remote a possibility as even I would have thought a month ago.
No, I don't disagree with you. I just think we're still at the very low end of probability. But it
I
is
hope
something
so.
obviously you have to keep our eye on because yeah, there can be messaging. It's not messaging, it's more condition setting, as we say in the military, as far as getting to the point of setting conditions for your success. We saw it in the first administration. If you're a Democrat, you would argue that Trump was able to put three judges on the court who now rule in his favor the majority of the time, except sometimes he has some problems with the chief justice, but nonetheless, I mean they will tell you that he set those conditions for future use, and they didn't think it would be a second term, but nonetheless, so there could be condition setting that's going on in the Pentagon. But I like to think that my colleagues in the military, many of them who are still my friends, um, understand what a lawful and unlawful order is. Mark, what do you think?
Yeah, let's break this down to a practicality thing. From an analyst standpoint, you've got to understand that the military itself, not talking veterans, talking active duty, they skew Democrat right now in their voting. So, right, you've got that to begin with. You've got people that are going to be questioning, not just from a lawful order standpoint, but probably in their hearts from a political standpoint, whether they follow these orders. And then you've got to consider that what we're talking roughly, John, correct me if I'm wrong here, 1.1 million active duty
Total.
service members
In total, yeah. If you
in
include
total.
Coast Guard, yeah.
Right. And so a lot of that support staff, some of those are stationed abroad. We're a country of 330 million people. You're not going to use a million soldiers, of which you would not have access to, frontline troops. How many frontline troops, John? 300,000?
Yeah, somewhere in there. I mean, talking like each server, I think we have like 10 active
Right.
divisions. It's
So 300,000 that could actually have the pointy end of a spear, assuming that you abandon everything abroad, you abandon your military approach to deterring China, et cetera, which they would love, right? If U.S. soldiers get sucked into that, because that's a huge green light for Taiwan. I just don't see it happening. I get the media hype about it. I get that it's a good story. I get that it's clickbait, but I think when you start looking at it from a practicality standpoint, I'm just not buying it.
Well,
And so
Mark,
I'm
you're
going to leave
looking
it
at
at
a
that.
national, you're looking at and I understand what you're saying. You're looking at it as if Trump was going to call the active duty army to go to every single city in the United States. Of course, that's nonsense. I'm talking about targeted arrests where he calls active duty troops to go to Philadelphia, goes to Little Rock, goes to Dallas, what have you. And you're right about the active duty military skewing Democratic, but not the National Guard and not the reserves, and certainly not the enlisted corps. They skew very conservative. And
But David, let me push back on that. Let's
okay,
say he does that. Let's say he goes to Philadelphia, a very democratic city. Do
well,
you
I
really
shouldn't have
think,
said
right?
Philadelphia. Yeah.
Do you really think, well, no, I mean, who's he going to go to? Republican cities? No, he'd go to Chicago. He'd go to
Yeah.
St. Louis. He would go to Philadelphia, right? In your scenario. Do you really think that hundreds of thousands of Democrats are going to stay home? No, they're not. And you're not going to have enough troops on the ground to control that. And so all it would become is some kind of shooting in situation. The optics would be bad, and the country would be in a huge uproar. I just don't see it. And suddenly, while you might argue that it's just troops in XYZ city, he would suddenly be facing massive protests in a bunch of cities around the country. I just don't see it. I'm sorry. I'm not saying never say never, of course. And you may have an isolated incident where he tries to invoke the Insurrection Act more just to test it to see if it works, the same way that he just did with the Alien Act in terms of trying to deport people. But I don't think it's part of a bigger master plan. I just don't see that.
Well,
Not at this point.
I agree with what you're saying. I don't think it's ever going to be a nationalized all over the country. But in the scenario you're talking about, yeah, there's going to be some shooting. I think if we had some shooting between active duty troops and National Guard troops, that would be a real disaster. And you're right, the Democrats wouldn't stand for it, and the locals wouldn't stand for it, especially in a Democratic city. I think that's a
It would make the
catastrophe.
Vietnam protests look like a walk in the park compared.
Yeah, and that's a
I don't. The
catastrophe. We
country is
all
too
lived through the
right.
Vietnam protest era.
Yeah, the
That
country
wasn't a
is too
fun
divided.
time.
Yeah,
It's not.
I
That's
just
not good.
I don't think they're that dumb. I mean, don't get me wrong.
Okay, okay.
I am not a supporter. I'm apolitical when it comes to that.
I know.
But I look, you
That's why you're on here because you're my
yeah,
balance.
there you go. Yeah, I think you have, and again, because I got to be careful here. I can't reveal sources and the like.
Yeah.
But for those people that are close to Trump, that have been in the room with Trump at the senior most positions in his previous administration, they all say, look, there's one consistent thing, like him or hate him. And this is coming from people that like him and coming from people that hate him, is that you've got to ignore the bombastic rhetoric. There is method to his approach. He does have an ultimate goal. He uses that kind of rhetoric to distract you away from what his goals are. Now, that doesn't mean his goals are good ones, okay? That's not a pass policy-wise that he's doing something wise. But I think when it comes to, if we go down this rabbit hole of saying Insurrection Act, which I've seen some do, I think that's, and not you, I'm talking about where I've seen this in the media. I think that's people trying to posture for electioneering purposes, but that's not what we or John, in my opinion, I'll let John speak for himself in a second here. I don't think that's what we as analysts can get sucked into, because then we're missing what he's trying to distract from. You got to remember, this is like a magic show. He's out there distracting. Our job is to, sift through all of that and get down to the analysis side of it, just like what John did for 30 years, trying to figure out what the enemy's intent is. John?
No, my mind goes back to to Rubio sitting on the couch in the Oval Office as Vance and Zelensky and Trump are berating one another. And he's got his arms crossed and a big sad face because he knows that this just turned out the exact opposite of the way it should have. And it's self-defeating. And I think many people probably in the administration at times feel that way also. They don't express it other than the verbal expressions. They don't say it out loud, but I think many are somewhat frustrated. And as Mark said, look, the president's an emotional guy. He acts on emotion more times than what we would like for him to act on, which is reasoning brought to the table, expert opinions coming in. What do the experts from Russia say? What do the experts from Iran say? What do the experts on the military say? It tends to be more along the lines of, what do I get out of this from a business perspective? And I think for many of us, that's frustrating because that's just not the way this country has been wired for the past 200 plus years. We've been wired to be the democracy that all countries look towards for balance, and we're losing that take, and that part's unfortunate. And I certainly hope that whatever this administration is working on ends that way. But we're going to have to sit through the entire movie, unfortunately, David, before we see how this works out.
Well, Mark, you had said it, go ahead. No, go ahead.
Yeah,
Go ahead.
if I could quickly add here, here's a real example of what I'm trying to say. Let's look at the tariffs, okay? If we looked at the distraction initially, Trump was coming out and saying this is all about reciprocity, that these countries are tariffing us, we're going to be reciprocal on our tariffs to them. That was the rhetoric, right? Turned out to be there was no substance to that rhetoric, because this calculation that he came up, and people can revisit the first part of this where we define that calculation, has nothing to do with the actual tariffs. So that tells me that the end game, if I sit here and try to put an analyst hat on, the end game for Trump is he thought this was just going to be an opening gambit in a poker game to ultimately negotiate new trade deals with every country. The problem is it didn't work out that way. The markets got ahead of him in terms of where he wanted to be. You started to see the implosion. You started to see fears about a new Black Monday that was derisively in some circles called an Orange Monday, didn't come about, and the like. And so that tells me Trump's real motive there, when you break through everything, was to try and get new trade deals with everyone. And it just got out of control. Now we're in his ego territory. Hubris is factoring in. He doesn't know how to back down at this point. He's kind of like Putin. This is not so different than the special military operation in Ukraine, where both men went about doing something that was ill-advised, not well thought through, and they thought it was going to be a 3-day campaign. I don't think Trump, if he was being honest with himself to the American public, really thought we were going to be in this situation. But he's not a guy that's going to back down easily in terms of these tariffs. So there's an example of where I think you just have to kind of ignore the rhetoric from him and try to understand what he's after. And you've seen in some circles, in support of my theory here, you've seen in some circles where there has been underreaction. For instance, Ukraine, for obvious reasons, says we're not going to retaliate. That makes sense. But the EU has extended an olive branch as well, saying we don't want to. Let's talk. So I think there are a lot of people in the geopolitical sphere that are understanding that. The markets didn't, because they understand the immediate implications of that small businessman or woman suddenly faced with like maybe owing $100,000 more on the products they just had shipped in that they ordered last week, thinking it cost X, and this week it costs 84% more because of the tariff China imposed. I mean, the tariffs that Trump imposed. So just that quick point.
No, I'm glad you made it. And again, I want to just stress that I am very happy when both of you are on, because I am not the analyst as you are. And in fact, I look at Trump and this whole administration from a little different standpoint, because my background is counterintelligence and also law enforcement. I look at him as a criminal. He's a criminal. I look at him as how I've looked at many criminals. I've looked at him as also how I would handle an asset. And to me, he's is illogical for an illogical wingnut as you can be when you try to analyze him. And that's why many analysts are constantly surprised at his next moves, because he's irrational. And I don't want to get into more of that, but I'm not surprised. And so I'm way over the moon with Trump as far as trusting him or thinking he has a plan. And on that, Mark, I have to disagree. His plan is vengeance. His plan is getting back on everybody who he ever think wronged him since he was birthed. from day one, and also his political enemies. And now it's extended to the world. And he's taken on, it's like a king when he says us. When he says us, he means me. So America is him. Trump, and he's looking for vengeance against everyone who he perceives has wronged America with these trade imbalances. And it's not a logical thing. I don't see him backing down. And if he does, it's only going to be where he thinks he's going to get an advantage to him because they came on bended knee and promised him something or kissed his ring. So I hate to say it. I can't agree that there's some logical, not even logical, that there's some method to his madness. But that's why you're on, because you hold my feet to the fire and don't let me get too crazy. And that's all I'll say about that.
Yeah, no, yeah, I'm going to push back a little bit. I mean,
Please.
Clearly Trump is a narcissist. I think anyone looking at him, he sees the world through himself, right? Anything that happens in the world, he relates it to himself. So, I mean, clearly we're dealing with a narcissistic individual. But again, digging past that and talking with people that have worked with him, they argue, and these are people that like him and these are people that hate him, that there is method to the guy's madness. Humans are complex. You can be wanting to do all those things, vengeance, et cetera, go after his enemies, et cetera. And to get that, that doesn't preclude him though from doing other things as well and having approach to it. And I think the problem that we're at as a country, and that what people are missing here. Again, I'm not taking a side here. All right, Trump is not my ideal kind of person as a president. If I could push a magic reset button, I'd go back to someone like Ronald Reagan and say, let's take that approach, peace through strength. Let's look at the world. Let's
I
try to.
heard that he offered you Secretary of Commerce, though, Mark. Is that true?
He did, but I was quite young then. So, but in terms of Trump being uh, all of these things, he can be more than just that. And I think it's important for us to understand that as analysts that you've got to look down to his actions and not get caught up in the rhetoric of it. What is his end game? For instance, there was a lot of talk about withdrawal of NATO. Let's get into real examples of it. The bluster that came out with him. He wants to destroy NATO. He wants to leave NATO. Arguably, and John's made this point before, and again, he can go too far with it, and the rhetoric may get ahead of where he wants to be at the end of the day. But was it so bad that he got Europe thinking about reinvesting in its own military? It actually wasn't, okay? Many countries weren't spending to the 2% GDP level required not required. That was a target goal. Let's be fair to those countries. He proposed 5%. Finally, Europe woke up when Trump basically said, and they feared that we were walking away from Ukraine. They woke up and they said, let's commit 850 billion euros to our own defense over the next 4 to 5 years. So, there has been an end result to some of his perceived madness. So I don't think as an analyst, I can discount that if I'm trying to understand the totality of the man. So, I mean, in one corner, I've got to deal with the fact that he is a narcissist, that he does make things about himself, that, for instance, he lets hubris get in the way in terms of the tariffs and stuff that we've seen in the last couple of days. But I've also seen where, to some extent, some of the policies that he's wanting to make happen, such as getting NATO to take on more of the burden, make it more equal, more comparable to what the U.S. has been doing, is important. And let's break that down one other place here, and then I'll defer to John here. One of the early comments that I got in some podcasts that I was in was like, oh, Europe, we're going to go it alone. We're going to do it this way. We're going to do it that way. And I'm like, look, you've agreed to spend 850 billion euros, which is a good thing, over the next 4 or 5 years. The U.S. is spending a trillion every year. The U.S. has been spending trillions every year for a long time in terms of its defense. That's about satellite technologies. The U.S. has several hundred military-centric satellites in space. Europe has 30 dual use. Maybe one of those is a military satellite. They have a lot of catching up to do. You don't do that with 850 billion euros. And so there is some method to his madness to Europe to say, look, you've been over-relying on U.S. power to protect yourselves. And I think the West in general is better off if the U.S. continues to invest in its defense the way that we have, but also getting Europe as the European Union to step up and doing something similar. They're not going to get there overnight. They're not going to get there in 4 years, but best that they be there in the next 5 to 10 years if you have a resurgent Russia. John?
No, the only thing I'd add to that is just technique. Okay, it's technique. It's the way in which he goes about doing business. It's how he exerts himself, the image of of forcing people to do things to get something in return. And I think that's the part that it alienates many of our allies, is that they feel that they're being, bullied into doing things. Look, everything Mark said, he's been, accurate in some areas, that NATO is underperforming as far as contributions, that in some cases, to the collective defense, that there's trade imbalance. I mean, he's accurate in everything that he's pursuing. It's just the technique in which he's using it. And then if you yesterday, he was gloating at a conference about how leaders were coming to him, and as he said, kissing his fourth point of contact. You don't need to do that. You don't need to gloat when you get your way. I mean, you're already being a bully, but now you're going to gloat once you get and that only further, alienates the allies down the road. So they're negotiating in good faith, and then you turn back on them. You're going to need those allies eventually, and when you do, and they're not there, then you put yourself in a bad position. And look, Trump's not going to be in office, for the next 10 to 15 years. He has he has a term of 4 years, and depending upon, this third term option that they're discussing, possibly that I doubt that would ever come to fruition. But he has to think about the United States after his term, and the conditions he's setting for that. And right now, the conditions are not favorable.
Well, both of you have mentioned the loss of faith. America has been a bastion of freedom. Our dollar has been pretty much the international currency for decades because of the faith that the world has in us as a safe haven, as an honest broker, an honest actor, and our soft power. That, if it's not totally gone, is dissipating very, very fast and may be gone. And the loss of faith, you both know this better than I do. Once our allies have lost faith in us, it's gone. It may never come back, at least not in our lifetimes. And Jonathan, I think that's what you're talking about. It's not even what he's doing, it's the way he's doing it that are causing animosity and eventually the loss of faith in America as a partner. And I'll have to say, Mark, I agree with you. Some of his actions are correct, but I'll leave us with this thought. Even a broken clock is right twice a day. Okay. And, I agree with him on immigration, and I agree with him on NATO countries having to pay more. That's about it. And you also forgot, he's not just a narcissist, he's a psychopath. He's a crazy man. He should be institutionalized. I'm sorry. Just,
Yeah, no,
yeah.
yeah, David, let me
I'm
respond.
sorry. It's the truth.
Yeah, let me respond to that real quickly. Look, I agree
Please.
with John. Yeah, I agree with John that the technique that Trump uses is wrong. Okay. And again, I'm going to repeat, this is not the style that I believe in as a president. The policies in some instances, in most instances, I'd argue, are not policies that I would personally advocate for. But again, it's like I think you have to be careful of falling for the rhetoric that often is geared towards his base. It's about shoring up his political base all the time and extrapolating from that to think that that's always his end game policy. As an analyst, we just don't see it when you dig down past the rhetoric. Now, having said that, let me give you the red meat that you've been looking for. I think there's a darker player. I think there's a darker player in this game that we're all losing sight of as we focus a lot on Trump. I think Trump is a showman. You can call him, he's a narcissist. You want to call him a psychopath, great, whatever names you want to affix to him, so be it. But he's a Barnum and Bailey type, circus president. It's just all theater with him to get to his end goals. I think the one that we need to be worried about, we've seen it already happen in the Oval Office. We saw the manipulations that he was doing against Zelensky. We saw it in the Signal group chat in terms of him already saying he disagrees with Trump's approach in terms of what was to be done with the Houthis. And who am I talking about? JD Vance. I think that's your true 1930s style isolationist that doesn't understand the overall position of the US in terms of world power, world equilibrium, and the like. And he's the guy that probably going forward, at least for me as an analyst, that I want to focus more on just how much influence he's having on policy development. Because in my opinion, he's the dangerous guy.
I don't disagree with that at all. And he is probably, arguably, the next Republican candidate after this. I don't think he's got a whole lot of competition right now. So that's a very frightening thought, but I believe you're absolutely correct. There
Right.
are people around him like JD Vance, Marco Rubio, who are smart. They do know what's going on, and yet they're caving in to Trump. And if a JD Vance does become the next president, I don't see the trajectory going the right way. And if anything, I see it going more in the wrong direction.
Yeah, and let's break that down because this is another example of what I'm trying to get at. Is an analyst, you look at someone like JD Vance. JD Vance is clearly trying to carve out his own policy positions within the administration. It's very clear that he's disagreeing with where in certain places that Trump is going and his team members are going. So, I mean, that tells you that it's not this cohesive administration that has an overall plan in terms of where it wants to be. It's more where Trump wants to take it, and you've got people trying to take it different directions. So, from that standpoint, that's what I'm trying to argue that it's important to separate Trump's words as much as he deserves to be pegged with them, right? No, the way he communicates to me is he has no sense of decorum. He's not a civil guy. You talk to people the way that he does. There's nothing about his approach to public discourse that I like. But from an analyst standpoint, where I have to factor out all of the emotion and just focus on the end results, when you get past all of that, you realize that maybe there's method to the madness. I'm relying on some inside sources to get to that point. But where I'm concerned about is how someone like a JD Vance starts to shade that over time. Now, it could be at this point, it's just too early to know. JD Vance could be overplaying his hand. He may be getting some comeuppance in private, or it may be that that influence grows over time as the administration gets deeper into its term. But he's a guy that I think we should be paying attention to because he could lead, and I'm talking purely national security. I'm not talking about any political platforms domestic or that are of a domestic nature. You know, I'm just talking about the national security places that he could take us. I think he is a guy that could argue, hey, we should just take Greenland. I think he is a guy that could argue, let's just abandon, Europe and NATO and the like. I think those are concerning things. So, John, I'm sorry, I may have talked over
No,
you.
all I would add to that is JD Vance needs to tone down the arrogance. And as a former commander of mine used to say, you got to play well with others. And right now we're not playing well with others. We want to dictate to others what they're going to do to support us, and we almost feel as though people owe us for what we've provided, if you will, for the last 50 years. When in fact we've been providing these things. We've been providing these services, if you will, these protections, these trade imbalances in order to maintain, I think, a strong democracy, a democratic governance throughout NATO and throughout other portions of the world. And I don't think charging people today for services rendered for the last 50 years is the right way of doing it. And again, tone down the arrogance. Let's start playing well with others, so we have allies to turn to when in fact we may need them later.
Well, Mark, I think you hit the nail on the head, getting, as you said, to the red meat of all of this. And I believe it is the most important point that Donald Trump is the spokesperson, the circus clown, the figurehead for a much darker side that's going on here, of which JD Vance is probably the next iteration. And very possibly, these are the people behind Project 25. These are the people behind MAGA, the actual brains behind all of this. And JD Vance may be the person who is going to advance even the more extreme isolationists or imperialists' notions of MAGA. And that is a frightening thought. That is a far darker thought. And I have to say, I totally agree with you. And it doesn't bode well for our future because at this point, a good 50% of the American voters, at least, like everything that Trump slash MAGA is doing in terms of not the tariffs per se, but Doge and pretty much everything else that's going on. So if they get a JD Vance out there pumping them up and rah 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 with a lot of money behind him, excellent chance he would win the next election and take us even further down this dark rabbit hole.
Yeah, no, it's certainly possible. And again, I can't comment on the domestic side. I just don't spend enough time analyzing that. I would make one general comment though. and this is just putting on my analyst hat again. Whenever you have a group of people, because I think it's been surprising to the establishment, to legacy media and the like, which John and I are obviously part of, it's been somewhat surprising that the support is so far stayed with Trump. And I think that it should be telling the other side, if you're on the other side here, something big here is that America, in whether it's perception or reality or a combination of the two, is not working for a lot of people. For instance, I saw some Democratic analysts pushing back, oh no, Jaguar and Land Rover are going to pause shipments of luxury cars to the US. Okay, that's true. And that's not good for the economy. But that average working class person can't afford a Land Rover or a Jaguar. And so that was terrible messaging, right, from a political standpoint. And it's telling you that these people that, hey, we feel left out. And why? Again, a lot of people were complaining about the 401ks and the like being demolished over the last week since this trade talk began. But who's not saying it? It's that working class that may not have as big of a 401k or something invested into that. So I think what I'm trying to argue here, and again, I've got to leave this for the domestic political analyst because I'm not one, and I'm not taking a side here, is why are we as a country so disconnected? Why does the white working class, I'm sorry, the white collar is what I meant, not race, white collar classes believe that this is terrible for them, and why do blue collar working men and women believe that this isn't so bad? It tells you there's a disconnect there. And I think it behooves both parties to try to understand that better, that America may not be working for everyone the way they want it to.
I agree with you, and that's a whole other podcast. But that has to do with messaging, in my humble opinion. A great deal of it, not all of it, because America's not working on many different levels. But a lot of that has to do with messaging. Again, I could go off. I'm not
Yeah,
going.
yeah, and I'm not taking a
I
side
agree with you.
here.
No, no, no,
Yeah,
no. And I know you're not. And you made excellent points.
yeah.
Look, for maybe more than half the country, America's not working. I think the next time around, unless the Democrats change their messaging and get off of their high horse, they're going to lose even worse. And to me, that's not a very good thing. But gentlemen, we have to go. We're over the time limit. We could do an entire another hour on this, no question about it. Again, I thank you both for coming on here. You do center me and hold my feet to the fire, and when I go off on Trump, which I still will do as soon as you're gone. But I do appreciate you being on here, both of you. Seriously, Jonathan Sweet and Mark Toth, thank you so much for coming on the No Delusion Zone again, and I'm sure we will talk soon. You both take care of yourselves.